The desert wind howled across the vast emptiness of the Taklamakan, sweeping fine grains of golden sand into spiraling whirlwinds under the pale moonlight. In the distance, the silhouette of the old Silk Road stretched endlessly, half swallowed by dunes, half lost to time. Dr. Armand Qureshi adjusted his scarf tightly around his face, shielding himself from the biting cold. For years, he had studied the ancient trade routes that once connected China to the Mediterranean, carrying not only silken spices but also secrets, stories, and souls. Tonight, he stood where history whispered the loudest, the ruins of a forgotten city buried beneath centuries of silence. The expedition had started weeks ago when Armand received a decrypted manuscript from the archives of Dunhuang, an ancient Buddhist site along the Silk Road. It spoke of Langzhong, a wealthy trading city that vanished abruptly around the 9th century. According to fragments, the entire population disappeared overnight. Merchants, monks, caravans, all gone, leaving behind only scattered remnants of jade and gold under the sand. Some called it a plague, others, divine punishment. But the final line of the manuscript sent chills down his spine. The desert does not bury its dead. It keeps them. Alongside Armand was historian Evelyn Ross, a specialist in Central Asian anthropology, and Jin Zhao, a local Silk Road researcher whose family had lived in the region for generations. Guiding their expedition was an old Kazakh nomad named Kairat, who knew these dunes better than anyone alive. Their team had been following a series of satellite images revealing unnatural geometric patterns beneath the sand, structures too precise to be natural. On the first night, the team camped beside the ruins of an old watchtower, now half buried. As they unpacked their gear, Kairat warned them in his gravelly voice, "This land remembers." At night, the wind carries whispers. Do not listen. Jin translated softly, hesitant to repeat the words. Armand smiled politely, attributing the warning to folklore, but Evelyn wasn't convinced. She had read too many journals of lost expeditions along this route, entire teams disappearing without a trace, their last transmissions filled with incoherent ramblings about shadows in the dunes. The following morning, under a burning sun, they began digging. Within hours, fragments emerged, pieces of pottery glazed with strange motifs, bronze coins bearing symbols unrecorded in any dynasty, and faded scraps of silk woven with patterns unlike anything documented. Then Marcus, one of the excavation assistants, unearthed a small wooden box sealed with wax. Inside lay a rolled parchment, astonishingly intact despite its age. When Evelyn carefully unsealed it, she found a detailed map of Langzhong, streets, market squares, temples, even a grand palace at the heart of the city. But at the edges of the map, handwritten warnings were scrawled in red ink. Do not walk when the bells are silent. That night, as the desert cooled and the wind slowed, the campfire crackled softly. The crew gathered around, studying the map, arguing about the next day's plan. Above them, the stars spread across the black sky, brighter than they'd ever seen. Far away, an abandoned minaret leaned precariously, its stone worn smooth by centuries of sandstorms. Somewhere in the distance, a sound echoed, faint but distinct, like the soft tolling of a bell. Jin frowned. There are no temples nearby, he whispered. Evelyn froze, glancing at Armand, who dismissed it nervously. Probably the wind playing tricks. But when the sound came again, closer this time, Kairat stood abruptly, his face pale. Inside the tents, he commanded. Now. That night, Armand couldn't sleep. He sat at the edge of his tent, staring out at the sea of sand glowing faintly under the moonlight. The desert looked alive, shadows shifting in patterns his mind couldn't explain. Just before dawn, he thought he saw figures in the distance, standing motionless atop a dune, staring at their camp. When he blinked, they were gone. The next morning, the desert was silent. Too silent. Even the constant whisper of the wind seemed to have vanished, leaving an unsettling stillness across the dunes. Armand stepped out of his tent, blinking against the bright sunlight, and saw Kairat standing on a ridge overlooking the excavation site. The old nomad's weathered face was grim. They were here last night, Kairat said without turning. Who? Armand asked. The ones who walk when the bells are silent. Evelyn emerged from behind, pulling her scarf tighter. I don't like this, she muttered. Every time we uncover something about this place, it feels like the desert reacts. Ignoring her unease, Armand rallied the team. We've come too far to turn back now. If Langzhong is buried beneath us, we'll find it. By midday, they uncovered the first signs of intact structures, carved stone pillars half hidden in the sand, their surfaces engraved with motifs depicting caravans, celestial bodies, and something else harder to interpret, tall, robed figures without faces, standing among merchants and kings. The carvings were ancient but oddly pristine, as if the desert itself had preserved them. Evelyn brushed the sand off one of the pillars and traced her fingers along an inscription etched in Old Sogdian. Her eyes widened. "It's a warning," she said softly. "Those who disturb the sleepers will lose their way and walk among them." Before Armand could respond, Jin shouted from the far end of the site. "I've found a passage." They hurried over and discovered a stone staircase leading downward, partially collapsed but still intact. Stale air drifted upward, carrying a faint metallic scent. Armand set up lanterns, and the team descended cautiously into the darkness. The chamber below opened into a vast underground hall, its ceiling supported by towering columns carved into the shapes of dragons and phoenixes. Fragments of murals lined the walls, depicting scenes of trade caravans, ritual ceremonies, and strangely, processions of people carrying bells. In the center of the hall stood a massive bronze door, engraved with unfamiliar symbols. "This isn't in any of the manuscripts," Evelyn whispered, kneeling to examine the base of the door. Tiny carvings along the threshold depicted human figures kneeling before something colossal, their arms outstretched in reverence or fear. Marcus, impatient, pushed against the door. To everyone's shock, it swung open with a deep groan, revealing a dark corridor beyond. Cold air seeped out, carrying the faintest trace of incense, impossible, considering this place had been sealed for centuries. The corridor led to a series of chambers lined with stone sarcophagi. Each was decorated with intricate patterns, but their lids were unmarked. No names, no titles, no prayers for the dead. Evelyn found this deeply unusual. Even in ancient dynasties, burials carried inscriptions, she said. These are anonymous. As they explored, Jin noticed something strange, faint red markings across the floor, leading deeper into the catacombs. When they followed them, the path ended in front of an open sarcophagus. Inside, the skeletal remains were dressed in silk robes embroidered with gold thread, astonishingly well preserved. But as Armand leaned closer, his flashlight caught something unexpected. The skeleton's fingertips were worn down, the nails cracked and broken. Almost as if it had tried to claw its way out. Suddenly, the low tolling of a bell echoed through the chamber. Everyone froze. Marcus's voice trembled. "Tell me that's coming from the surface." Kairat shook his head slowly. "No, it's beneath us." The sound grew louder, resonating through the stone walls, vibrating in their bones. Armand felt his chest tighten, his breath shallow. Evelyn grabbed his arm, whispering, "We need to leave. Now." But before they could retreat, the lanterns flickered violently and went out, plunging them into darkness. In the pitch-black silence, Armand heard something moving, soft footsteps, deliberate, surrounding them. Jin fumbled for his flashlight, but before he could switch it on, something cold brushed past his shoulder. "Who's there?" Marcus called out, his voice cracking. No answer. Only the slow tolling of the unseen bell. Finally, Armand managed to light a torch. The warm glow illuminated the chamber, and revealed faint figures standing at the far end. Their forms were blurred, like heat haze, but unmistakably human-shaped. They didn't move, didn't breathe, only stood watching. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the figures vanished. Terrified, the team scrambled out of the catacombs and back into the blinding sunlight. No one spoke for a long time. Kairat finally broke the silence. "I warned you. This city does not want to be found." That night, the desert came alive. The wind returned, carrying whispers that seemed to drift from nowhere. The temperature dropped sharply, and the stars glimmered like shards of glass overhead. Armand lay awake, staring at the map they had recovered. In the margins, next to the cryptic warning about silent bells, he noticed something he hadn't seen before, faint symbols etched into the parchment, almost invisible unless viewed at an angle. He traced them with his finger and realized they matched the patterns on the sarcophagi below. The whispers outside grew louder. The desert night was unnaturally cold, as if the air itself carried the weight of centuries. Armand sat near the dying campfire, his eyes fixed on the ancient map spread out before him. The faint symbols he had discovered matched perfectly with the carvings they had seen in the underground hall, spiraling shapes intertwined with bells, faceless figures, and pathways leading deeper beneath Langzhong's ruins. The connection sent a chill crawling up his spine. Evelyn emerged from her tent, her face pale and strained. "You're not still thinking about going back down there, are you?" she asked quietly. Armand hesitated, staring at the glowing embers. "We've come too far, Evelyn. If Langzhong's disappearance is tied to these catacombs, we need to know why. Or maybe we need to leave before we end up like them," she countered, her voice cracking slightly. Before Armand could respond, Kairat approached, his footsteps silent against the sand. The old nomad lowered himself beside them, staring into the fire without speaking for a moment. Finally, he said, "My grandfather told me stories of Langzhong when I was a boy. Merchants called it the jewel of the Taklamakan. Riches beyond imagination. But one night, travelers said they saw fires in the sky, heard bells ringing for hours, and when they arrived the next day, the city was empty. Not destroyed. Empty. As if the people simply walked away." Armand frowned. "Walked where?" Kairat's dark eyes glimmered in the firelight. "Into the desert. Following the bells." Later that night, Armand lay awake in his tent, the whispers in the wind louder than ever, carrying fragmented voices in an ancient tongue he couldn't understand. At some point, he must have drifted into a restless sleep, because he woke to Evelyn shaking him violently. "Armand, get up. Marcus is gone." They rushed to Marcus's tent and found it empty, his gear untouched, his footprints leading away from camp, straight toward the ruins. Jin grabbed a lantern, and without hesitation, the team followed the trail through the dark. The wind had died again, leaving only the crunch of their boots on the sand and the distant echo of something ringing. As they neared the catacomb entrance, the sound of the bell grew clearer, deep and hollow, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. Armand's heart pounded as they descended back into the underground halls, lanterns casting long, trembling shadows on the carved walls. The sarcophagi chamber was exactly as they had left it, except one more stone lid had been pushed aside. And Marcus stood in the center of the room, motionless. "Marcus," Evelyn called softly, stepping forward. But as the light from her lantern fell across his face, she froze. His eyes were open, glassy and unfocused, staring into nothing. His lips moved faintly, forming words they couldn't hear. Armand approached cautiously and placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. The moment he touched him, Marcus gasped sharply, as if surfacing from deep water, and collapsed. When he came to moments later, he was trembling violently, whispering the same phrase over and over. "The road of bells, the road of bells." Jin crouched beside him. "Marcus, what road? What are you talking about?" But Marcus only shook his head violently. "I saw them," he stammered. "Hundreds of them, walking, all carrying bells." Evelyn glanced at Armand, her face ashen. "We need to get out of here." Reluctantly, they helped Marcus back to the surface and returned to camp. But sleep was impossible. Throughout the night, the sound of distant bells came and went, sometimes faint, sometimes unbearably loud, until just before dawn when everything fell silent again. The following day, Armand examined the map more closely, focusing on the strange spiral symbols. With Jin's help, he deciphered fragments of an older dialect hidden beneath layers of ink. The translation chilled him. "When the last bell tolls, follow the sleepers. The gate opens to the city that breathes beneath the sand." A city beneath the sand. Could Langzhong still exist, buried but intact? Against Evelyn's protests, Armand decided to follow the spiral path marked on the map. By late afternoon, they reached a towering dune shaped unnaturally like a crescent moon. There, half buried, they found what looked like the remnants of a stone archway, its lintel carved with intricate bells and faceless figures. As they dug, the sand gave way to reveal a massive stone gate beneath the dune. Unlike the other entrances, this one was sealed with a lattice of interlocking slabs, each engraved with strange, overlapping patterns. At the center, a carved indentation shaped exactly like a bell. Evelyn frowned. "We need a key." Before they could investigate further, a low vibration rolled beneath their feet, and the ground trembled. The ringing returned, louder this time, resonating from somewhere deep below. Then, without warning, the gate shuddered, and began to open. A blast of cold, stale air rushed out, carrying the unmistakable scent of incense and decay. The team exchanged uneasy glances, their lanterns flickering in the sudden draft. Inside lay a descending tunnel, its walls lined with murals depicting scenes that grew increasingly disturbing, processions of merchants turning into skeletal figures, masked priests ringing bells as shadows swallowed the city, and finally, faceless forms kneeling before something vast and monstrous, hidden beneath swirling clouds. Whatever happened here, Jin whispered, it wasn't a plague. Armand's grip tightened on his lantern as they stepped forward into the darkness. The tunnel stretched endlessly downward, twisting deeper into the earth until the air became heavy, damp, and strangely warm. Somewhere far below, the bells continued to toll. Suddenly, Evelyn froze and grabbed Armand's arm. Look, she whispered, pointing at the wall. There, etched into the stone, were hundreds of tiny handprints, not carved, but burned into the rock itself, as if seared by unimaginable heat. The further they descended, the louder the bells became. The air vibrated with each toll, and the whispers returned, this time clearer than before. Faint voices, speaking an ancient language long forgotten, surrounded them on all sides. Marcus clutched his head, groaning softly, muttering words that weren't his own. Then, the tunnel opened into a vast subterranean chamber, unlike anything they had seen before. Massive stone structures stretched across the cavern, carved with bells, dragons, and faceless saints. Pools of still water reflected the dim glow of their lanterns, and faint motes of golden dust drifted through the air, shimmering like fireflies. And there, in the center of the chamber, stood an enormous bell, suspended by chains thicker than a man's body. It was cracked. Armand stepped closer, his voice barely a whisper. This is older than Langjong itself. Kairat's face was pale as he muttered an old prayer under his breath. That bell, he said, was never meant to ring. Then the ground trembled violently, and somewhere deep within the cavern, something stirred. The cavern trembled beneath their feet, sending tiny pebbles tumbling from the ceiling. The enormous cracked bell loomed over the team, suspended by rusted chains that creaked ominously with each vibration. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, as though the very stone walls were breathing. Armand tightened his grip on the lantern and turned to the others. Stay close. We don't know what's down here. Kairat shook his head slowly, his face pale. You still don't understand, he said softly. This place is not Langjong. This is what was beneath Langjong, the city of the sleepers. Evelyn glanced sharply at him. The sleepers. You've heard of this place. My grandmother told me the legend, Kairat replied. When the traitors vanished, they didn't die. They were taken, called by the bells into the city below the sand, where they would walk until the stars burn out. He stared at the cracked bell. This is where they were led. Before anyone could respond, Marcus staggered forward suddenly, his face pale, his eyes wide. I can hear them, he whispered. His voice trembled, as though someone else was speaking through him. They're calling us to follow. Marcus, stop, Armand ordered, grabbing his arm. But Marcus wrenched free and began walking toward the massive bell, as though pulled by invisible strings. Then they heard it. A sound like thousands of footsteps, faint but growing louder, coming from deep within the darkness behind the bell. Jin swung his lantern toward the sound, and froze. From the far shadows, pale figures were emerging, dozens at first, then hundreds, stepping silently across the cavern floor. Their faces were hidden beneath tattered silk veils, their bodies draped in ancient, decaying robes. Each figure clutched a small bronze bell, and with every synchronized step, they rang them softly, a haunting, rhythmic chime that echoed through the chamber. Evelyn grabbed Armand's arm, whispering, Those are the traitors. The team began backing away, but the figures stopped abruptly, as though sensing them. One of the veiled forms stepped forward, moving with unnatural fluidity, and raised a hand in a slow, deliberate gesture, pointing directly at Marcus. Marcus fell to his knees, clutching his head, screaming in a voice that was no longer his own. The last bell must toll. Suddenly, the cracked bell above them let out a deafening, bone-shaking note. The chains groaned violently, and dust rained down from the ceiling. The entire cavern shuddered as the ground beneath them split in jagged lines. Run! Armand shouted. They sprinted back toward the tunnel, but the pale figures began following, their bells ringing louder and faster, their steps unnervingly soundless despite their speed. The rhythmic chimes reverberated in their skulls, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. The further they ran, the more the air grew thick, almost liquid, pressing against their lungs. Finally, They reached the spiraling tunnel and began scrambling upward, their lanterns swinging wildly. Behind them, the ringing grew chaotic, mingling with distant whispers in an ancient tongue none of them understood. Marcus stumbled, collapsing against the wall, his eyes rolled back as he mumbled incomprehensible phrases. Armand and Jin hauled him up, dragging him forward. Evelyn was gasping for air, tears streaking down her dusty face, but she didn't stop running. Kairat muttered prayers under his breath as though warding off unseen forces. They burst out into the upper chamber, but something had changed. The murals on the walls, once depicting merchants and dragons, now seemed different. The faces had melted into indistinct shapes, the robed figures' eyes gouged out, and across the stone pillars, fresh crimson streaks dripped slowly downward. "Keep moving," Armand yelled. But just as they reached the stairway, the tolling of the massive bell below thundered once more, and the entire ruin shifted violently. Sections of the ceiling collapsed, filling the air with choking dust and scattering shards of stone. In the chaos, Evelyn fell, her lantern smashing against the floor. Armand turned back, grabbing her hand and pulling her to her feet, but froze when he noticed the sand beneath the cracked tiles. It was moving. Slowly, impossibly, the desert itself was sinking into the ruins. The sound of bells was deafening now. They weren't just ringing from behind them, they were everywhere, above and below, vibrating through the air like a living pulse. And then came the voices. Not whispers this time, but thousands speaking in unison, overlapping and dissonant. "Join us. The road is open. Walk until the stars are gone." Suddenly, Marcus ripped himself free from Armand's grip, his face twisted, his voice layered with something alien. "Don't you see? We were meant to find this place," he cried, running toward the archway. "It's calling us home." Before Armand could stop him, Marcus crossed the threshold and vanished into the darkness. No sound, no scream, just gone. The remaining four staggered out of the ruins and into the open desert. The night sky blazed with unnatural brilliance, the constellations distorted, unfamiliar. The crescent-shaped dune behind them trembled violently before collapsing entirely, burying the entrance beneath thousands of tons of sand. The ringing stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was silence. And then, faintly, from deep beneath their feet, came the toll of a single bell. Days later, the surviving members reached the nearest outpost on the Silk Road. Armand reported everything to local authorities, but when they returned to the site, there was nothing, no ruins, no carvings, not even a trace of the crescent dune. The desert had swallowed it whole. Back at camp that night, Armand lay awake, staring at the ancient map under the flickering lamplight. But something had changed. The spiraling paths, once leading toward Langjong, now formed a new pattern, a circle enclosing the words. "The road remains open." Somewhere far away, faint and distant, he thought he heard the soft tolling of a bell.